Right. I thought I'd give you a visual evocation of the book that I have written, Asia After Europe. The year was 1903. Abanindranath Tagore removed a huge European oil painting from the wall of his studio and sold it to a wealthy art collector, Rajendranath Mullik. This was to create space for an Asian work of art to be executed by the great Japanese painter Yokoyama Taikan. The chosen theme was Rash Leela, the love play of Radha and Krishna on a full moon night. Abanindranath described the scene to Taikan, and Taikan began work. The sky shone with moonlight, but Taikan was not satisfied. Every day he removed the cloth from his painting and said something was missing. One morning he arrived to find that the women at home had collected fresh shiuli, the white autumnal flower, on a plate, and some had blown across the room. So he went and collected them, scattered them onto his canvas, and was hugely delighted. And then he looked at each flower and began to apply the orange color of the shiuli. The moonlit night soon came alive with a rain of flowers from the sky, and the breeze dropped them in the midst of the dance of Ras Leela. Taikan planted a kodam flower in Radha's hand, draped a garland of shiuli flowers round her neck, and curled a bunch around Krishna's flute as well. So let's have that next slide, the picture. The one before. Yeah, that is Rash Leela. And so the painting was hung on the wall after Taikan had framed it himself, decorating it with the border of a Baluchari sari. And a party was thrown for everyone to come and watch Rash Leela. Now, this process of mutual understanding and learning through artistic conversations across Asia unfolded gradually. A disheveled Taikan, wearing a straw hat, would roam the streets of Calcutta, furiously sketching every detail that caught his eye. At first, Abanindranath could not see the smoky touch of Taikan's coal on silk, but in time he began to appreciate the style. Both Taikan and another painter, Hishida Shunso, embraced Indian themes in their works. And Hishida painted Saraswati, the goddess of learning. So let us have that one. And you can see the white lotuses at the feet of Saraswati. And Taikan's Kali and Hishida Shunso's Saraswati were bought by Sharna Kumari Devi, Rabindranath's sister, Sarala Devi's mother. And having observed Taikan and Shunso do the Japanese wash, Abanindranath took the plunge himself, and he was so impressed with that beautiful effect that from that point onwards, the Japanese wash became an intrinsic part of Indian painting. And of course, the most famous example is the next slide that I'm going to ask to be shown, Bharat Mata by Abanindranath Tagore. And the original is sitting right here in the Victoria Memorial right now on loan from the Rabindra Bharati Society. Now let's move forward. All this was happening even before the Swadeshi movement. This is 1903. And during the Swadeshi movement, of course, the bonds were strengthened. But in that period, it was some kind of a cultural interaction. And it was during the period of the First World War that one begins to see that young Indians would be thinking in terms of daring, both in terms of their intellectual adventure as well as their political adventure. And let me just give one example from the 1910s. There was a young Indian scholar who later became the father of Indian sociology, Binoy Kumar Sharkar, who traveled in Japan and China for 15 months. And after spending quite some time in Japan, he mused, "What have I seen in Japan?" And he answered, "In England and America, I understood the language of the people. I could converse with them in their mother tongue. Yet I felt oddly out of place. Hapchara was the Bengali word used in those societies. They too were unable to accept me as one of their own. I have not understood the language of the men and women of Japan. Yet standing on any street in any city or village, I have felt as if I have been watching the scenes of Calcutta. In their gait and look, their posture, their manner of speech, their laughter and humor, their modest and respectful demeanor, their customs of greeting and serving guests, in all these matters I have found India. In its heart and mind, Japan is a part of Asia. It has only imported some scraps of iron from Euro America." Now, Binoy Sharkar had been admitted to the circle of scholars and artists in New York and Boston during 1914 and 1915, and again in 1917 to 1919. Yet it was this feeling of being oddly out of place that was recorded candidly in his Bengali writing and was depicted in Florine Stettheimer's oil painting, Studio Party. And that's the slide which I'd like you to see next. What you have here is what has been described as the awkwardness of Sharkar's pose, which, according to one historian, belies the centrality of his placement. But for Binoy Sharkar, it was not a pose. He felt awkward or kapchara in this milieu. So the intellectual engagement with Euro America and the affective bond with Asia represented distinct modes of internationalist belonging of a colonized Indian intent on shaping a new global future. From Japan, Binoy Sharkar went to China, and there he said something very interesting. He felt closer to Chinese Muslims than Chinese Buddhists. He said that he understood the historical relationship between Indian Buddhists and Chinese and Japanese Buddhists. But he wrote, "The music that sprang from my heartstrings as soon as I encountered Muslims here, why did it not sound on the same strings when I met the Chinese and Japanese Buddhist worshippers of Shakyamuni?" And he gave an answer. And that answer is so relevant for the present day that I will read it out for you. Maybe India, and then he says, "I cannot remember the four corners of that vast country. Let me speak of Bengal. India or Bengal is not just Hindustan. It is also Musalmanstan. From a historical perspective, of course, Hindustan is the land of Hindus, Parsis, Jains, Christians, Sikhs, and Muslims. But for all practical purposes in the Bengali mind, Bharatvarsha was Hindu Musalmanstan." And after that comes a lyrical passage. "From their birth, Hindu friends played with Muslim friends, and children of both faiths grew up together. After that, in bazaars, shops, and markets, in grazing pastures and agricultural fields, in religious fairs and religious practices, in festivities and in distress, in famines and in cemeteries, Muslims were companions of Hindus, and Hindus were companions of Muslims. The blood and breath of Hindus and Muslims were inextricably mixed." So, that is what he felt led him to feel an affinity with Chinese Muslims when he encountered them. Moving ahead, the 1920s, all of you know that in 1924, 100 years ago, Rabindranath Tagore visited China for the first time. And let's see a picture of him in China, the next slide. So here he's being welcomed by the great Chinese political leader and intellectual Liang Qiqiao. But not everyone welcomed Tagore in the same way. The Chinese communists felt that he was importing a strange kind of Indian spirituality and therefore were quite critical of him. And that is why his notion of the intrinsic relationship between beauty and hospitality had a better reception in Japan, where he went next, than in China. Now, in the 20s, there were a few competing universalisms. Asian universalism, but there was also Islamic universalism. And at the same time, there was the new communist internationalism. And from 1927 onwards, communist internationalism and Asian universalism went their separate ways. However, Islamic universalism was still alive in the late 20s and early 30s. And one of the best exponents of that was another poet philosopher, Iqbal, whose picture I will ask for to be shown now next. Uh, Iqbal here is in Jerusalem in 1931, attending a World Islamic Conference. And he basically said that we don't need to add the prefix pan to Islamism, just as it was not necessary to add the prefix pan to Asianism either. And he felt that pan-Islamism was being regarded as by European imperialists as something akin to the yellow peril, which was quite wrong. And so this is what we find in West Asia at this time. Let's go to the next slide. I'll just take you through the slides. You know, the global color line was so significant in those days that an African American intellectual, probably the most famous one, W.E.B. Du Bois, went to Japan. And at that stage, he was welcomed as a representative of nearly 12 million African Americans by the Japanese. And they were all arguing about the importance of racial equality. And this went so far that a figure like Du Bois even justified Japan's invasion of China when he returned to the United States, saying that if Japan did not utilize the period of the Great Depression to assert itself, then China will remain under European colonial control. So there was a bit of a problem of not recognizing oppression when it did not take racial lines. But this is an important aspect that needs to be understood. Let's have the next slide. When Japan invaded China, Subhash Chandra Bose sent an Indian medical mission. It left on August 28th from Elgin Road, what is now Netaji Bhavan, and then by March of 1939, the doctors were having lunch with Mao Zedong in his cave in Yan'an. So that's an image that I wanted to share with you and have written about this quite extensively. Let's have the next one. Now, Noguchi had come to India, the poet, the Japanese poet, in late 1935 and early 1936. And at that time, he had been warmly welcomed by Rabindranath Tagore and Mahatma Gandhi and Sarojini Naidu and so on. But in 1937, Tagore became a critic, and there was a great battle of letters between the two poets, which I analyze in my book. Let's have the next slides. Okay, in 1940, a very famous Chinese painter came to Shantiniketan. And here you see his portrait of Rabindranath Tagore. This was Shu Bei Hong, and he worked very closely with Abanindranath, Nandalal Bose, and Binod Bihari Mukherjee. And he did this painting of Tagore, and then the next slide, he did a sketch of Mahatma Gandhi, who had visited Shantiniketan in 1940. And next, he then traveled to Darjeeling and did this wonderful landscape of the Kanchenjunga, the magic of the Himalayas, in ink and oils. Next one. Now, this is, of course, there were three great wartime famines that took place, and I write about them in this book. The famine in Bengal, of course, but there was an equally gigantic famine in Henan province in North China, and a third one in Tonkin in northern Vietnam. But here I'm simply showing you Nandalal Bose's depiction of the Bengal famine in his painting Annapurna and Rudra. He does it in a combination of tempera and Japanese wash. Annapurna is seated on a lotus, and you have Shiva standing before her, reduced to a skeleton holding a begging bowl. So this is the war period. Let's have the next slide. Subhash Chandra Bose from Burma had tried to send rice to Bengal, but that was not possible. His offer was suppressed very nervously by the British. And he, of course, raised the Indian National Army. He went to Japan. He lived with the family of the governor of the Reserve Bank of Japan, Shibusawa Shakuro. And here you see him with the Shibusawa family. Let's have the next one. Now, Subhash Chandra Bose knew that paintings had been very much a key part of the relationship of India and Japan. So even when he went to the Greater East Asia Conference, he decided to visit the Ueno Museum of Art. And next to him, you see Anand Mohan Sahai, Asha-san's father, and Abid Hassan, who had traveled with him on the famous submarine voyage from Europe to Asia. And at that stage, Noguchi wrote a poem, Chalo Delhi, inspired by Netaji's slogan. Let's have the next slide. There was an Asian Relations Conference that was held in Delhi in March of 1947. It was presided over by a poet, Sarojini Naidu, a poet politician. And she had missed presiding over an all-Asian women's conference in Lahore in 1931 because she was in prison for taking part in the civil disobedience movement. But she was there in 1947, and she talked about, the unity of Asia, and asked, who wants a monotonous culture? Who wants a uniform culture? Who wants a colorless culture? And it was what I have described in this book, colorful cosmopolitanism, that would bring Asia and Asians together. Let's have the next one. Gandhi came to the Asian Relations Conference, and he begged the visitors from abroad not to take back the memories of the carnage that was taking place in India at that time, because there was already quite a lot of Hindu-Muslim violence as our country hurtled towards partition. Now, in the 1950s, there were lots of exchanges between India and China. And one of the most important visitors who has left a vivid account of China in that period was K.T. Shah, a close associate of Netaji, and who was the presidential candidate of the opposition against Rajendra Prasad in the early 1950s. But there were others, and D.D. Kosambi, the historian, he was there at a preparatory committee meeting for an Asia Pacific Peace Conference. So let's have the next slide. At that meeting, Diego Rivera's The Nightmare of War and the Dream of Peace adorned the conference hall in Beijing in June of 1952. And a young historian has perceptively argued how that conference played a crucial role in the emotional making of an internationalism that stretched from Asia to Africa and Latin America. And in fact, the Indians and Pakistanis got together and even came to an agreement on Kashmir at that particular non-official gathering. Let's have the next one. But, I mentioned Shu Bei Hong a little while ago. So in 1952, one of the Indian delegates was none other than M.F. Hussain. And M.F. Hussain went to Shu Bei Hong's studio and saw his horses and was so inspired that his own horses got a new vigor, once he engaged with Shu Bei Hong. And among others who visited was somebody all of you would have heard of, the great singer, Debabrata Vishwas. And he and Surinder Kaur sang Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai together. But then towards the end of a performance in Beijing, he sang Shukanto Bhattacharya. And when he performed the immortal lines, Bidroho Aaj, Bidroho Charidike, rebellion today, rebellion everywhere, the young Chinese stage manager synchronized flashes of red light that enveloped the hall. Mao Zedong was in the audience. Chu Enlai hosted a banquet, and Chu Enlai urged Debabrata Vishwas to sing that song wherever he went in China. But then, of course, less than a decade after the expression of this bonhomie, India and China would be fighting a border war in the Himalayas. Let's have the next slide. This is a picture I took of the Sila Pass when I visited Arunachal Pradesh. A good part of the 1962 war was fought there. Now, why did this happen? The slide from solidarity to animosity had much to do with the inability of new citizens to effect change through the realization of anti-colonial aspirations and the tendency of managers of states to opt for post-colonial continuity in the definition of sovereignty and borders. And the inheritances from colonizing Europe ultimately proved weightier than the legacies of the best in anti-colonial Asian thought. And yet, even at that moment of rivalry and conflict between Asian nation states, an intellectual quest began to discover what a Japanese scholar of modern Chinese literature, Takeuchi Yoshimi, evocatively called in 1960 Asia as method. And it's significant that in the 1960s, Japanese art in the domain of culture enabled the spirit of Asian universalism to survive the wartime depredations of Japanese nationalistic imperialism. And I'll next show you an example of that. Nandalal Bose's celebration of the Indian countryside in his art, creatively drawing on the Japanese sumie style. And Japan continues to inspire fresh departures in South Asian art, as it did just over 100 years ago. One luminous example is the last slide I will show, The Bridge by Shahid Jalal from his exhibition, Memories of Japan, that opened in Lahore in May 2022. In conclusion, I will simply refer to an essay, a 1932 essay that Tagore wrote titled Asia's Response to the Call of the New Age. In it, he wrote, once I went out to Eastern Asia to welcome there the birth of the new spirit of humanity. There in the easternmost sky of Asia was fluttering the triumphant banner of Japan, encouraging new hope in the heart of Asia. I experienced joy, yet my mind was deeply disturbed. What followed in Tagore's essay is as relevant today as it was in 1932, even though the identity of the Asian country flaunting triumphalism has changed. The presumptive leader of Asia had not, according to Tagore, learned the art of civilization which heals and unites, but had trained her hands under Europe in the science that inflicts wounds with efficiency. The calamity to which I refer to is tragic, the poet wrote in grim prose, not merely because of its political consequences, but for its cruel destruction of human possibilities. Can Asia after Europe save itself and the world from such a calamitous fate? Rising to that challenge, in my view, would require a determined reimagination of a pluralized continentalism. And that power of imagination lies well within the range of the best attributes of Asian universalism that can expand and not destroy the aspirations of humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sugata, Professor Bose. And this lecture has made my task very easy because I had many, many questions from the book, which I don't have to ask now. So, while reading this book, I hope that all of you will read it when it becomes available for all of you. It reminded me of a weaver. When you imagine a weaver, not all of us have seen him at work, but he's holding so many threads, and then he's using the other hand to make a beautiful sari. And I told him that he's made a dhakai jamdani for us, because the way he has brought in various aspects of Asia and the world is it's amazing. The book is just amazing. So since I don't need to ask very specific questions, I'm going to ask a little broader questions. Um, we know that humanity has always remembered and forgot and remembered again. So you are talking about the long 20th century, where where you are writing about people in that century remembering the past events, as well as people who are writing about what happened in the past. So, presumably, they are remembering things that have been forgotten. That is quite understandable in the 17th, 18th century to have, because of the difficulties, geopolitical difficulties, and communications difficulties. People may have forgotten what have happened in the past, in many centuries preceding that. But today, in the 21st century, which is just a few decades away from the 20th century. And in this time when communication is so easy, traveling is so easy, how is it that we need to remember so much? I mean, how is it that we have forgotten? So, you and many other scholars are actually doing this work of and writers as well, not just scholars, but writers as well. So, why this book is my question, and why Asia after Europe? Because you are writing about a time when Europe is very much in the horizon and present.
Okay, let me take your final point first. What do I mean by Asia after Europe, or what is the significance of the after in the title? I was talking not just about Asia after the European colonial presence, but this book is also a conceptual effort to write about universalism and cosmopolitanism beyond European definitions of reason, national identity, and so forth. And that is why I have suggested a bit cheekily that my project of provincializing Europe does not require a peg of European theorists on which to hang my history of Asian connections. I was thinking, of course, of Dipesh Chakraborty's important book, which is really framed around a conversation between Marx, representing the universal narrative of capital, and Heidegger, who is representing the European hermeneutic tradition. So that's the sense in which I wanted to talk about Asia after Europe. I'm glad that you thought that my weaving together many different threads of Asian connections seem to have come together in the form of a Jamdani sari, because I uh, was, following the trail of elites and subalterns alike. Asians who traveled around the continent, and I chose characters, some of whom are well known and remembered, and then there were others who were being rescued by me from undeserved oblivion. And in successive chapters, these characters return. And that is, I think, you know from a craftsman perspective, or a weaver's perspective, that is exactly what I was attempting to do. And I felt that there have been works studying ancient connections across Asia, or medieval or early modern connections, but I was much more interested in, if I am to use your term, modern memories of ancient bonds, but even more than that, how in fact there were modern reinterpretations of ancient bonds. And a figure like Tagore is doing precisely that when he's traveling not just to Japan and China, but to Southeast Asia. It's not so much about what the bonds may have been 1,000 years ago, about which he's writing poetry, but what he imagines them to be and what he sees to be important in the 20th century. And that's why, this is a work of history, and it's a work of historical interpretation. But towards the end of the book, what I've been trying to suggest is that Asia stands at the crossroads when many alternative futures beckon. And what should we take? What should we select from inheritances from our past to take with us on an uncertain journey ahead? Even if communications have speeded up, uh, there are certain um, ideological legacies that weigh us down. One of them being the European model of the nation state, with its notion of monolithic sovereignty and hard borders. And I'm suggesting that if we go fully in that direction, then Asia will not be able to realize its potential in the 21st century.
I'll ask you just one more question before opening it out for all of you. Is that the elephant in the room? That is the different Asianisms. Do you think that that is still a problem today to move forward?
I'm glad that you've mentioned Asianisms in the plural, and that's in fact what I do. Even when I talk about Asian universalism in the singular, sometimes I use the plural. I talk about many versions of Asian universalism, again competing with other universalisms that were also trying to transcend the borders of colonies or incipient nation states in the age of nationalism. And that's why I talked about religiously tinged universalisms. I also talked about communist or Bolshevik internationalism. That these were very important in the first half of the 20th century. Yes, there is a very thin dividing line between universalism and imperialism. I was advocating for the more generous versions of Asian universalism, and I'm very, very suspicious even of universalist boasts, which will degenerate into internationalistic imperialism. And the reason that I invoked Tagore at the close of my opening remarks was that he precisely was suggesting that there had been such optimism about the rise of Asia, shall I say, with Japan leading at the turn of the 20th century, and yet a European style conflict. We think about Europe and the First World War, conflict between nation states. But it was basically a European style conflict in 1937 between Japan and China, which undermined the Asian idea. And what I was hinting at towards the end was the identity of the Asian country, which is supposed to be the leading edge of the rise of Asia in the 21st century, has changed, but some of the dangers are very similar and perhaps have become even uh, more potent in the 21st century, which is why at this uncertain moment I wanted to write a book that in some ways foregrounded the more uh, uh, enlightened, shall I say, the more broad-minded, the more generous versions of Asian solidarity. But my book is also analytical, and therefore I try and show what precisely were the historical factors that enabled the forging of Asian solidarity, and what were the factors that fractured Asian solidarity.
So you are saying that looking outside towards Asia will probably solve most of the problems that the youth face today?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that if we, in fact, imitate too much the Euro-American nation-state model, I think we will go astray. But in terms of interpretation, I also am not prepared to draw a hard border, around the concept of Asia, because I am placing Asian connections in a larger global context. And it's important to note that sometimes the searches for some kind of Asian universalism occurred beyond the territorial confines even of Asia. And for example, I write about the encounter between Okakura and Rabindranath Tagore in Boston. Boston figures quite prominently in this work. Or a Liang Chiqiao began to rethink his idea of Asia during a lecture tour in the United States of America. So, yeah, global context is important, but blindly following Euro American models would be a catastrophic error.
Thank you. Can we have some questions from the floor? Yes, that lady over there. Uh, Stand up, please. Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. When we read books like this, we often have a sort of romanticism or nostalgia about the countries that have been good to us in a way. But when we come to reality, we are standing at crossroads with some of them. So how do we form a balance in our perspective so that we can not overlook their contribution while not become too much affected by them, and also so that we can observe our own faults as well? How do we establish a balance between these things?
Yeah, I mean, the point that you're making about being self critical is actually extremely important. And um, uh, and I think what you're suggesting is that there should not be a kind of a competition, uh, even between who has made the greater contribution to the more generous forms of Asian universalism. Are we going to take credit for Japan or China or for India? And in fact, one of the ways in which I have dealt with this particular uh, challenge is by bringing Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia. I haven't been able to talk about their versions of universalism in these brief remarks, but that's how I have tried to do a particular kind of balance, that it's not just the major countries, so-called, of Asia who were taking part in these Asian conversations, and I bring West Asia into my frame as well. But most importantly, my answer to your question would be that let us not take the countries, as you put it, or specific nation states as our unit of analysis. Uh, that is precisely what I haven't done. And I have basically written about Asia as a zone of connections, of conversations, but also some degree of competition, not discounting that as well. So I think my answer to your question would be not just empirical, but conceptual. That let us think of modes of analysis that are quite different from the emphasis on specific nation states.
We will have just one more question, the gentleman over there.
Thank you, Professor Bose. My question is uh, a very good thesis, but when you actually think of concrete international formations, like you said, we shouldn't think of the nation state or hard boundaries. Probably, I don't know your views on parliamentary democracy, but probably parliamentary democracy and nation state came together or are together realities. But if you talk of pan Asia or all of Asia, what is the exact political formation you have in mind? I mean, we already have regional formations like ASEAN or SARC and so on. So, would you advocate a deepening of those, or would you have something more romantic in mind, something more cultural?
Well, in my book, I write about both culture and politics. And in fact, as you would have seen in my opening remarks today, I privileged art and poetry, even music, when I talked about Debobro Tobisha singing in Beijing and so on, than hard politics. But there's enough of politics in my book as well. Again, I would elaborate further. Being skeptical of the nation state is not necessarily being just romantic. And what I would say is that I write about how even far-sighted political thinkers broached their ideas of what in the early 20th century came to be described as Asiatic Federation. The first Indian political leader to do so was Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das in the Gaya session of the Indian National Congress in December of 1922. And another very major leader of the early 20th century, who is comparable to C.R. Das, was Sun Yat sen of China. So I do examine their ideas about Asiatic Federation, which even a Subhash Chandra Bose was referring to and drawing upon in the period from 1943 to 1945. Now, the associations that you talked about, one is a utter failure, SARC. The other is more of a success, ASEAN. But these are, in some ways, statist projects. And I even have a long section on the Bandung moment and era in my book, which I haven't been able to discuss today, where I am somewhat critical of the statist bias of Bandung, even though it did offer some blueprint of Asian African solidarity. All that I will say is that, you know, in some sense, the European Union was a success despite the stresses and strains that we see, after the cataclysms of the two world wars. But in a way, I'm glad that at least ideas about Asiatic Federation or some kind of Asian solidarity, these tend to be less state driven than European integration. Of course, I will accept that simply thinkers, far less, poets and artists, will be able to bring some kind of an interconnected Asia into formation. For that, it will require also far-sighted statesmen to take on some of these ideas. But I would still make a case for what I would describe as an interreferential and interconnected Asia. An Asia where Asians, regardless of their citizenship in different nation states, would still be prepared to learn from one another uh, in trying to think about the future and indeed a global future. The famous book by Binoy Kumar Sarkar in the early 20th century was in fact called The Futurism of Asia.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, because of the lack of time, we'll have to bring this session to a close. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for coming out in the rain.